For a number of years now, the city of New Bedford has been working hard to solve the problem of homelessness. I think I can say with some certainty it's not an easy problem to solve. Agencies in New Bedford have formed the Homeless Service Providers Network to work with the homeless population, that is. Among those organizations is the city's Office of Housing and Community Development, led by its director, Patrick Sullivan. Pat, it's good to see you again.
It's great to see you, Jim.
What role, Pat, does the Office of Housing and Community Development play in combating homelessness? What is your role with the Providers Network?
We provide them staff support and organizational support, and this was established going back to 1994 is when it first formed, and I think there was about 8 members back then, and we're up to about 50 organizations that belong to it. We meet the third Thursday of each month in our office in our large conference room, and it's really about developing strategies to combat homelessness. And it's a very diverse group. It's made up of business folks, nonprofits, hospital groups, community health centers. So it's really diverse because all of those type of agencies deal with homelessness on one level or another.
So that's how New Bedford tries to combat the problem with planning. And, of course, there needs to be money to solve this kind of a problem. Each year, the federal government provides funding to cities around the country to help the homeless. What is the philosophy here in New Bedford? Does the money go to you folks and it's distributed in that way out?
Actually, our other block grants work in that manner. This is a competitive grant application each year, so we help to write that. We have subcommittees of the HSPN that provide us a lot of information. It's a very robust application, probably about 120 pages. It requires a lot of work and collaboration, but we have a core group within the HSPN that really works closely with us. But it's very competitive, and we've been fortunate to receive funding each year since 1996 as part of that process, and we receive about $1.5 million that provides grants to a variety of different agencies. So we have competitions. We ask for people to submit proposals, and they're reviewed and ranked and placed into that application, and then ultimately HUD decides how much money we get and who gets funded.
How are we doing in actually serving the homeless? Now, we've got this apparatus set up, as you've explained, to acquire money. It is competitive, but money comes into the city every year. How are we doing in actually helping the homeless? Knowing full well, I think those who watched this problem in New Bedford have seen that if people want help, they can get help. If they don't want help, it's going to be awfully hard to convince them to come in from the woods, under the bridge, wherever they are, to seek that help. So how is it working? How are we meeting the goals set out in,
I think
in grant money?
Two areas, Jim. One, we instituted 2 years ago a coordinated entry process that is overseen by Catholic Social Services. So in the past, people would enter the system by going to any agency in the city. They were evaluated and then placed in shelters or transitional housing or permanent housing as those needs. But they were all evaluated by different methodologies and prioritized differently. So we came up with a systemic approach to coordinated entry, and that means that everybody gets evaluated with the same criteria. There's a process that we utilize. It's a national model of prioritizing which folks, and usually those are folks that are chronic homeless, get placed first. So those are folks that are constantly going through the system. And the second part of that is a housing first rapid rehousing model. So we're trying to get them from homelessness right into permanent housing. The cycle of folks going to a shelter, going to transitional, maybe having some substance abuse problems or mental illness issues, and then they're back going through that cycle again. This process puts them into permanent housing and provides those wraparound services that they need. So that's those types of case management aspects really help folks to stabilize in housing, and that's kind of the philosophy nationally.
The shelters, though, are the front line
They are.
in dealing with homeless folks. In New Bedford, it's cold now, not as cold as it will be probably, but do we have enough shelters for the homeless in New Bedford? And how has the Overflow Shelter worked out? I mean, those seem to be, again, the front lines. How has that all worked?
That's actually the Overflow Shelter has worked quite well, and that's a collaboration between the city, Catholic Social Services, the HSPN, and Rise Up for Homes. So Rise Up for Homes is kind of the philanthropic arm of the HSPN, and they've been able to do fundraising and raise dollars to help augment the cost to operate that overflow shelter. So that's worked pretty well. We've had in the past a need for an overflow to the overflow, just because of on some of those cold winter nights, it's been difficult to house everyone. But generally, we've been very successful in getting people off the streets in these dire weather conditions.
Do we need a family shelter in New Bedford? We talked about this permanent housing situation, putting people in permanent housing. Do we need a family shelter?
We actually have one. Harbor House is a very successful family shelter. We have seen a rise. That's one population that we've seen in the last 7 years, exponential rise in the number of homeless families. And that's something that's a continuing need in the community. So we have a shelter for males, a shelter for females, and there's a family shelter as well. And we have a couple of domestic violence programs that have shelters for that population.
You're listening to Townsquare Sunday. I'm Jim Phillips. My guest is Pat Sullivan of the City's Office of Housing and Community Development. Federal funds make up a lot of this homeless initiative, if you will, a strategy. Are you concerned about possible cutbacks in federal funding for programs for the homeless? I mean, we're not quite sure what this budget's going to look like. Maybe you can shed some clarity.
Yeah, I mean, we're always concerned about that. I think nationally, the homeless programs have fared fairly well overall. Strategically, some of the other programs that actually support some of the development that goes along with homelessness have been challenged. The president had zeroed out the community development block grant program and the home program in last year's budget, and fortunately, Congress, with bipartisan support, reinstated that, and it was level funded again. So it's always a concern. Will continue to be a concern, but we're looking at ways to, outside of just federal assistance, to leverage resources. And we've been, one example is partnering with South Coast Hospitals. They've been doing a lot of collaboration with our HSPN and dealing with, medically fragile folks that are homeless. So their expertise is dealing with folks that are medically fragile, but they're not a social service organization that deals with all the other issues. And similarly, our shelters are not equipped to deal with folks that are medically fragile. So collaborating with them and helping them to deal with folks that are homeless that are sent there for a medical reason, could be some temporary issue. We're really trying to focus on that. We've had great strides in working with South Coast Hospital on that issue.
So part of the best way to perhaps to combat this problem is building partnerships, getting more people involved, getting those people involved that maybe were on the outside or on the periphery, getting them to dive in and help out.
Most definitely. Yeah. It's all about collaboration, and there's not a magic solution to this. Poverty and homelessness are global issues, and they're interchangeable. When folks get unemployed, sometimes they're homeless. Folks that have mental health issues, that's a large subcategory of a lot of the homeless populations in New Bedford, and a lot of that information is derived through our point-in-time count. So we're going to be doing that again January 24th and 25th, and that provides us with a lot of information about why people became homeless, where are they now, demographics of that population, what are some of the challenges that they're facing, what are the hardest to house folks dealing with. And
point-in-time count, for those who may not know, is an effort made by the Homeless Service Providers Network to tally get as correct account as possible on how many people are actually homeless at that point in time. And it involves interviewing people in shelters, and it involves going out into the night, into the cold, to find people, talk to people, and see if they'll talk to you, at least in some form or fashion.
Exactly.
Yeah. What else could New Bedford use?
Well, I think we're, always looking to connect people with employment opportunities, and we've been working with our Workforce Investment Act agency and state agencies and trying to find employment opportunities for folks. The goal is, to get folks back into the mainstream and into productive workforce situations. So that's another important aspect of this, and kind of stable housing. Stable housing is really the root of trying to solve this issue and providing those wraparound services. So to the greatest extent that we can do that, we continue to do it. So a lot of the funding through our federal opportunities provides subsidies to folks to get into permanent housing, and a lot of the families have succeeded in doing that and have been weaned off that and have gained gainful employment and
how many? You know a number?
We probably have, there's probably about 550 folks that are assisted through permanent housing right now. There's about 250 in our shelters and maybe another 200 in transitional housing, and those are all in one way or another, assisted through a variety of different programs and initiatives. So when folks are placed in those situations, they're provided with these support services. So that's the key, trying to connect them to either mainstream resources or employment opportunities to get them living independently again. So I think we've been pretty successful overall doing that, but the challenge still remains.
Yeah. Does your office have some goals for 2018? I should clarify and say perhaps, does the network have some goals for what the year ahead?
Yeah, I think improving our existing systems. I think the South Coast Hospital Initiative is something that we'd love to try to dive into a little more and come up with some specific solutions. I think the coordinated entry and the placement is important to collaborate with all the agencies. So when folks come in, they're provided with the resources and understanding and prioritize of where they could be placed. So we, like a great example is we collaborated with the United Way and the family shelter for folks fleeing Puerto Rico. And there was about 108 families that have been intaked so far. And that was a nice collaboration by United Way, the Bedford Housing Authority, and PACE. And we provided, our office provided a street sheet, a resource guide for those folks. So sometimes things pop up and you have to react to them. And I think having such a stable and collaborative group as the HSPN and the partners have helped to really address some of those issues that come up that you're really not prepared for when you have natural disasters.
Yeah, and we had a previous guest on in this program, Major Parkhurst from the Salvation Army, who predicted we're going to see more people from Puerto Rico. It's very likely. Very likely we will. You may be called on again to provide those guides. Pat, it's great to see you. Our thanks to Pat Sullivan of the New Bedford Office of Housing and Community Development, giving us some information about homelessness and how New Bedford is combating that. The grant announcement is usually early in the new year. Is that?
They generally try to do that. They try and coincide it with the wintertime and in between the holidays, traditionally when it's done. So.
All right. You've been listening to Townsquare Sunday, heard every Sunday at 6 a.m. on 1420 WBSM. My thanks to production director Jason Kent for getting the program on the air. This week, Brian Rose stepped in, and also digital producer Casey Sylvia for posting the program online. If you missed the program, you can visit our website, WBSM.com, to catch up. All the segments are posted there. Thanks for listening. I'm Jim Phillips. Have a wonderful week and a great Sunday.